right, it is 7 o'clock. Do we have everyone here? It looks like we've got a full quorum. And it looks like we're recording also. Great. With that, we will go ahead then and call this February 24th Albany Planning and Zoning Commission meeting to order. Item 2, roll call, please.
Yes, Commissioner Donaldson. Commissioner McLeod.
Here.
Commissioner Moman. Commissioner Pilch.
Present.
Chair Waddy.
Here. Thank you. Item 3 on our agenda is ex parte communications. Do any commissioners have any ex parte communications to disclose?
No.
Seeing head nods across the board, there are none to disclose. That will move us to item 4 on our agenda, which is the consent calendar. The consent calendar items are considered to be routine and will be enacted on by one motion. Approval of the consent calendar indicates that staff recommendations will be adopted unless otherwise modified by the commission or pulled off by a member of the public. We have one item on our consent calendar this evening, item 4-1, the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting minutes from January 27th. First up, are there any commissioners that would like to pull this off the agenda?
Oh.
Yeah, yes, I would.
Okay. And maybe before doing so, can we just turn to staff? Are there any members of the public that would like to comment on the meeting minutes from January 27th before we turn it over for discussion?
There are no members of the public.
Okay. With that, then public comment is closed. Commissioner Pilch, you had comments on the meeting minutes?
I'm sorry, I don't. I remembered that when I was looking these over, something struck me, and then I read it again, and it's fine. So no issues. We can proceed.
Okay. And Commissioner Donaldson, you also had your hand up? You're on mute. Commissioner Donaldson, you're on mute.
All right, I didn't realize that. Thank you. Yes, I don't have a problem with the minutes and could move to approve them, but they do raise a question for me, and that was on the project at 1248 Portland. We had continued that to a date certain of February 10th, and I'm just curious about the status of that. We shouldn't change the minutes, but I'm just raises a question in my mind. That's all. Mm-hmm.
Actually, I believe we had continued it to March 10th. When we had this at the commission in January, there was inclement weather on the horizon, and the applicant was going to be unable to install the story poles safely. So we'd actually pushed it out and asked the commission to push it out until March. Okay, well, I'm glad I asked. Then I can move approval of the minutes with the change of on page 2, line 2 of to the date to March 10th instead of February 10th. Mm-hmm.
Second.
Okay.
Oh, you're Chair, you're muted.
Thank you. Great. Then on that motion with a second, Commissioner Donaldson.
Okay. Aye. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Commissioner McLeod.
Aye.
Commissioner Moman. And Commissioner Pilch.
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. That motion passes 5-0, and that will take us on to item 5 on our agenda, which is general public comment. This is the opportunity for members of the public to comment on items that are not otherwise on our agenda this evening. Staff, do we have anyone from public comment wishing to speak under general public comment?
It doesn't look like it. I don't see any hands raised.
Okay, great. Then with that, we'll go ahead and close public comment and move on to item 6 for action items, of which we have none, which moves us right along onto item 7 on our agenda, new business. We have 2 items listed here. First up, item 7-1, the 2023 to 2031 housing element study session. Do we have a staff?
Yeah, just to refresh the commission's memory, one of the big projects we'll be working on over the course of the next 2 years is an update to the city's housing element. We worked with Barry Miller for the previous cycle, the 2015-2023 cycle, and we're lucky to have him again, and we're looking forward to working with him on this next effort. And so tonight, he will be providing a presentation, giving you some background information on the housing element. And with that, I'll turn it over to Barry.
Great. Thank you, Anne, and good evening, commissioners. Can everyone hear me okay? Great.
Yes.
And Commissioners Pilch and Donaldson, it's nice to see both of you again.
Good
It
to see
seems
you
like
back.
just yesterday we were adopting the last housing element, but that in fact was 6 years ago.
Yeah.
So time flies, and we hope you've been having fun. We're here this evening really for the kickoff of the next housing element, and I have a PowerPoint. I'll be sharing my screen and then walking you through about 20 slides or so, and then leaving you with some discussion questions. And we thought we would give the commission an opportunity to ask some questions or provide some thoughts about the some of the issues we're going to have to grapple with in the housing element. And it's more than housing, I think, is going to be the takeaway. There's a big land use challenge embedded in this housing element update that we'll be speaking with you about. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, and I'm going to make this full screen. Okay, just to confirm, can everyone see the PowerPoint that's on the screen? Terrific.
Yep.
Okay,
Good.
great.
It's good. Mhm.
Great, thank you. So we're going to start with just kind of an overview, a high-level overview of what the housing element is. This is a mandatory component of the general plan. Albany updated its general plan last in 2015, 2016, and the housing element update was kind of front-loaded in that process because it was due to the state by January 31st of 2015. So this is the part of the long-range general plan for the city where we express our policies for the conservation and production of housing, and particularly focusing on housing affordability and meeting the housing needs of all of our residents. This element is unlike any other element of the general plan in that its contents are very rigorously established by state law. There are many prescriptive requirements that are in the government code that we must meet. Every city and county must meet these same standards. And this is the only element of the plan that is subject to state certification. So we have a lot of leeway in what we put in our transportation element or our safety element, but we really have to kind of stick to the letter of the law with the housing element. The housing element is also unique in that it covers an 8-year planning period. So typically with the general plan, we're looking at 20 years. We're planning for what's going to happen in 2035 or 2040. With the housing element, we're working off of this state legislated schedule, which is different in each part of California. So the Bay Area is on a different schedule than Southern California, and the San Diego region is on a different schedule, and so on. And our due date for the next housing element is January 31st, 2023. So we have to have an adopted housing element by that time, and that will carry the city through January 31st, 2031. Part of this being subject to state certification is that there are also consequences to not being certified, including the loss of eligibility for a number of grants that the city relies on for housing programs. And there's a significant legal risk if you're out of compliance, both from other agencies and nonprofits and from the state itself. In terms of the contents of the housing element, again, as I mentioned, a lot of this is dictated by the government code. We have some flexibility in how we organize the contents, but at the end of the day, you're looking at these basic 5 components. So you have an evaluation of the progress that's been made since the last housing element was updated. Essentially, how have we done since February 2015 when that last element was updated? You have a needs assessment, which looks at population, income, age, race and ethnicity, language, household type, owner versus renter occupancy, special needs, including seniors, persons with disabilities, our unsheltered population, large families, and so on. Housing trends, including the age of the housing stock, the mix between single family and multifamily, incidences of overcrowding, home values, rental trends, overpayment, in other words, how much of one's income is required to afford a home or an apartment in the city, and then an assessment of the housing at risk of conversion from affordable to market rate during the planning period. So all of that is statutorily required in the needs assessment. Then we have the constraints analysis, which covers government constraints. This is things like our zoning standards, our municipal code ordinances, design review processes, our permitting fees, impact fees, and so on, and then non-governmental constraints. So this would include things like infrastructure availability or environmental constraints, steep slopes, floodplains, earthquake hazards, and so on. The resources and opportunities section is where we show our capacity to meet our housing needs. And this includes both the sites in the community that are available to accommodate housing and our financial resources. It also looks at things like energy conservation resources, because that can reduce housing costs. And then essentially you take the sum of all of these analyses and create a set of goals, policies, and actions that are intended to meet your housing needs and move the city forward in the future. And there is an annual progress report that's prepared for the housing element, usually submitted around April, that dictates, or that actually documents how the city is doing and progressing towards meeting its needs. And a lot of this is quantified and measurable, as you'll see. So these are the 5 goals that are expressed in the existing Albany housing element. Conservation of existing housing is really how can we protect and enhance the housing we currently have in the city, make sure that it's habitable and good quality and remains around for the duration of the planning period. The next is the production of new housing to meet existing and future housing needs. The third goal is to meet special housing needs. This could include the needs of unsheltered residents or seniors or others in the community who may have housing needs that are not going to be met by the private market. There's a goal to reduce housing constraints. And again, you can see the connection here. A lot of this ties back to the analyses that are in the previous slide. So, how are we going to amend our zoning or reduce our fees or take proactive measures to eliminate constraints? And then finally, eliminating housing discrimination and really ensuring fair housing policies in the city are not just on paper, but are actually implemented in practice. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or the RHNA. That's the acronym, RHNA. And this is actually not new. It's getting a lot of publicity now because the numbers are so high, but this process has actually been around for more than 50 years. And essentially, the state requires that every city and county has to plan to meet the housing needs of everyone in the community and do its fair share to meet the community's share of the region's housing needs. So it's both about accommodating the local need and accommodating the regional need. And RHNA is a state mandate, but it involves the collaboration of the Association of Bay Area Governments, which works with cities and stakeholders to develop a formula that assigns the regional housing need to the individual cities and counties in the region. And I will walk you through how this process has gone during this most recent cycle. So before we do that, I just wanted to touch base on this issue of income categories. You'll see throughout the housing element, throughout our conversations, references to very low income, and moderate income. In particular, we're looking to provide housing that's targeted towards households that are in different income categories. Our RHNA number is actually divided into these income categories. And so when we're planning for housing, we're actually consciously looking at how many units are going to be affordable to very low income, and so on. So these are the upper ends of the income ranges for these different categories based on household size. Just as a reference, 4 people in a low income household could be earning $104,400. That's the household income. Now that surprises a lot of people. They tend to think of low income housing as housing that's serving folks who may be unemployed or who may have no income or income like 25 or 30,000. But it's actually a fairly large band of really workforce folks that are in that low and often very low. And really it's the extremely low income households that have, in some cases, the greatest unmet needs. But we're looking at meeting the needs of all segments of the community. As a benchmark, we also make a lot of references to affordable housing. We're talking about housing that requires less than 30% of your income. So you would have to do the math. That's going to be a different number for every household in each of these income categories. For a low income household of 4, that's that household making $104,000 a year. Their affordable housing threshold would be about $2,600 a month. So if you're spending more than $2,600 a month and your income is $104,000, you are cost burdened, meaning you're spending more than what would be considered affordable on your housing. There are many households that are in that situation. So this is how the Bay Area as a region has been doing in meeting its housing needs. And I'm going to pause for a minute here on this slide. In the first column, you see the last 3 housing cycles, including the one we're in now. So you can see the total need for the Bay Area that was determined by the State Department of Housing and Community Development. This is the number of housing units that were needed in the region to meet our need during the planning period. Then you see the number of permits that were actually issued. And at first glance, you think, well, it looks like we did pretty good in meeting our need. The challenge is that we're meeting our needs for above moderate income. We're not doing a good job meeting our needs for very low and low income in particular, not so good at moderate either. I do want to emphasize the data for 2015 to 2023 is only for the first half of the planning period. So 2015 to 2018, we don't yet have data for 2019 and 2020 included here. Those numbers are obviously going to go up a little. The percentages, we're doing a little better, but they're still way below where we need to be meeting 100% of the need. And that is reflected in the assignment that's been given to the region for the next 8-year planning period. So there's a lot of conversation now about the RHNA for the upcoming planning period. Last July, the state determined that the regional need for the next 8 years is 441,176 units, which is a 135% increase over that last period. So from 187,000 all the way up to 441,000. And that's a combination of the unmet need in the current planning period and the anticipated need over the next 8 years based on job growth and population growth and other factors. And of course, this is before COVID, before some of the economic impacts that we've experienced in the last year. But this is the number that the state has given to the Bay Area and that ABAG is working with. And I do want to say that there is controversy around this number. There are folks who think that it is double counting or overcounting, and there are, you can go to a webinar almost any day of the week on why this number is wrong. But there are also, there is an imperative to begin planning for this number soon, and ABAG has gone through the process of taking that 441,000 units and allocating it to the individual cities and counties in the region. Now, how did they do that? They created a 37-member housing methodology committee made up of elected officials, staff, and housing advocates from all over the region. That group met multiple times for over a year and considered different methods for taking that 441,000 units and assigning it to the 101 cities and 9 counties in the Bay Area. There are 2 basic avenues that they could have gone in the way that they allocated that need. The first is to prorate the need by population. In other words, if your city has 1% of the region's population, then you get 1% of the 441,000. Or by growth potential, and because ABAG was updating Plan Bay Area 2050, the regional plan, they have good data on what the growth potential is for each city in the region. They determined that they elected to allocate by population. A lot of cities were very upset by this decision and have written letters to ABAG saying, as a consequence of prorating by population, what you're doing is you're assigning a lot of growth to cities that are relatively built out, that don't have a lot of capacity or room for growth. And you're not assigning the housing necessarily to cities where we're expecting a lot of growth in the future. It's actually more complicated than that. That's a very simplified way of structuring it. But I think the point is that the prorating by population kind of creates some difficulties for a large number of communities. The other thing I wanted to mention is that baseline number, and this, you're not expected to memorize what's on this slide, but the idea here is that once that baseline number is established for what your assignment is, it is adjusted further based on weighting factors that consider equity and access to high resource or high opportunity areas. So if you're in a community with good schools, with high incomes, you are going to get a higher share of very low and low income units. If you're in a community that has a lot of job potential, that has good transit, you're going to get higher allocations of above moderate and moderate. And actually your total allocation is going to be skewed up based on your access to both opportunity and employment. So there are a number of weighting factors that enter into the equation as well. So here's the bottom line. This is the RHNA for Albany for the last 3 housing periods and the 4th period that's coming up. And let me just also clarify that we refer to these as cycles. So I don't show on this slide cycles 1, 2, 1 and 2, but what you see here are cycles 3, 4, 5, and the 6th cycle, which is what we're heading into now, 2023 to 2031. We're looking in Albany at a 232% increase over the current allocation. So the current allocation for the current planning period is 335 units. The future allocation in the next housing element for Albany is 1,114 units. I want to point out that Plan Bay Area is forecasting a smaller growth increment for Albany for the next 30 years. So it's a little perplexing why the city is being asked to plan for more units in the next 8 years than it is expected to add in the next 30 years. This is the subject for many letters that have been sent by other cities in similar situations. And I will tell you, because I'm working with a couple of those cities, there are about 30 communities that are looking at an even greater increase. Piedmont, for example, is looking at a 900% increase in their RHNA relative to their last allocation. Mill Valley is looking at a 600% increase relative to their last allocation. The smaller, more affluent cities are generally seeing increases that are in the 400, 500, and 600% ranges for their RHNAs for the next cycle. And so, as you can imagine, there is a lot of pushback at the local level. This is the breakdown by income for both the 5th and the 6th cycles. So you can see it's a little bit subtle, but the percentage for very low and low is going, actually for very low is going up a little. the percentage for above moderate is going down a little. This reflects that equity adjustment. The bottom line here is that the city must plan for 486 low and very low income units over the 8-year planning period. Planning for very low and low income units means a couple of things. Primarily, it means we have to designate and zone land that has the capacity to accommodate multifamily housing at a certain density. And that density is 20 units per acre, which is not particularly problematic in Albany. Most of the development that the city has seen in recent years is in the above 20 unit per acre range. This becomes a problem in communities that are rural residential, places like Portola Valley or Los Altos Hills, where you really might have a hard time, or where there's no sewers and so on, of building in that density range. That is not really the issue here. It's really finding enough land that can accommodate that quantity of development, whether it's low, moderate, or whether it's low, or whether it's moderate and above moderate. So how do we meet the RHNA? This slide shows a couple of the different options. First of all, we can count development that's in the pipeline. In other words, projects that have been approved, that are under construction at the time we adopt the RHNA. If we haven't issued certificates of occupancy at that point, we are able to count those projects toward our RHNA. Vacant land, there is not a lot of vacant land in Albany that's zoned and planned for development. So that's a relatively small sliver of what's available. The underdeveloped residential sites, these are primarily sites that are zoned R3 that have a single family house on them, or even a duplex in some cases. They're properties zoned for multifamily that are underdeveloped based on what the zoning permits. And you do find these properties, particularly in the area close to El Cerrito Plaza, the blocks north of Brighton and east of San Pablo Avenue, have a number of lots where there are single family homes that are zoned for apartments that could redevelop in the future, and that are redeveloping in some cases with proposed projects. Underutilized commercial and mixed use sites, this is really where most of the city's housing capacity is, and it's mostly on San Pablo Avenue. In the last housing element, most of the capacity that we identified was associated with sites on San Pablo Avenue. Accessory dwelling units, we're able to count those to a greater degree now that there are incentive programs and that they're legal everywhere, and that they're much more accepted than they used to be. So we can make more aggressive assumptions about how many ADUs will be created, and many of those do serve the lower income RHNA numbers. So we can rely on some of those, certainly not 400 units, but there's a chunk of capacity there. At the end of the day, we will need to almost certainly do some rezoning or upzoning to allow more units somewhere in the city. And this can take a number of forms. One is to increase the allowable height and density. In other words, the same use is permitted, but we're allowing another story, another 10 feet, or whatever that may be, another 10 units per acre, and so on. Increases in unit type, and this is something the city of Berkeley is now looking at, which is to allow 2 and 3 plexes in single family areas, or to allow housing where it's not allowed today. So there are properties in the industrial area where housing is not permitted, where we could consider housing in the future. This is actually an excerpt from the current housing element, and it is the map of potential housing sites. I wouldn't try to focus too much on this. I think the idea is really to show the general distribution is along the corridor, along the San Pablo corridor. We were not overly aggressive in what sites we assumed, which is good, because there are some limitations on reusing the same sites we used last time that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. And again, just a sampler of what some of those sites are. So we have the Goodyear tire location on San Pablo. We have the Hertz rental car place near Dartmouth. We have the former Sizzler on the avenue. There's a vacant lot on Solano, kind of near the BART tracks, that's shown in the bottom right here. This is more just to get a sense. We're not talking about vacant sites We're talking about sites that have a large area of parking, in most cases, a small area of building coverage, relatively large lot sizes, relatively large for Albany. So here are some of the restrictions. Our task is made more complicated by the fact that we can't reuse sites from the last housing element unless we establish a minimum density on those sites and establish by right zoning. In other words, no use permit required. The project can proceed with discretionary review. The definition of what vacant, well, I should say the allowance for using vacant sites is a little, non-vacant sites is a little more onerous now. If there's an existing use on the site, we have to come up with a program potentially to phase out the existing use and create new incentives for housing. We're more limited in using small sites, and we have a few of these. For example, that vacant lot on Solano Avenue was a small site, less than half an acre. There are some limitations on using these sites. We essentially have to provide evidence that those are viable development sites for affordable housing before we can claim them. So the last housing element looked only out to 2023 in what it assumed, but our general plan is for 2035. So we took a look at the general plan. It anticipated an increase of about 815 housing units by 2035, but 175 of those units were in Belmont Village, which is built. So obviously we can't count Belmont Village in the next housing cycle. We were a little lucky to be able to count it in the last housing cycle, in that it is independent living, but there is some question about where assisted living meets independent living, and at some point, if you're talking common kitchens and so on, certain types of congregate care facilities can't be included, but the state did allow us to count Belmont Village in the last element. When you take that out and you subtract the remaining columns there, we're left with a shortfall of 474 units based on the current inventory of potential housing sites. And again, part of this task will be to close that gap by looking at projects in the pipeline. We don't know when the Saha project on Cleveland will be completed and occupied, probably not in time to count it for the next cycle, or actually probably too soon to count it in the next cycle. The San Pablo Avenue specific plan becomes really important in this process. It's going to create some additional capacity that we'll need to look carefully at. There may be some sites on Solano Avenue, for example. We may be looking at the Safeway site, which is not counted. I should mention on San Pablo Avenue, the Albany Bowl site was not included last time, so we'll be looking at that. That is an opportunity site. University Village, we did presume some housing last time. We may be needing to look at higher densities on that site. Cleveland Avenue in the East Shore corridor, not target most likely, but there may be some other sites on East Shore or Cleveland that we'll need to take a look at. The west side of Albany Hill, more aggressive accessory dwelling targets and so on. But the point is that there's going to be some tough decisions here that will be made. Almost through with the presentation, just a couple more slides to highlight. In addition to showing that we have the capacity for a larger arena, there are some new state requirements, one of which is SB 686, affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH for short. You'll hear that acronym more frequently in the future. AFFH means that we are, I put the definition straight out of the state's website here, meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. This is taking fair housing a step further and really looking at the data on how fair housing laws are being implemented at the local level. There is some data on impediments to housing that we will need to look at, and then potentially developing new programs that ensure that the city is being proactive about fair housing law and contributing to fair housing and housing opportunity for persons of all backgrounds in the future. I want to point out with this is a new requirement, and everyone is kind of looking over their shoulder at how other cities are doing this. And Southern California cities are ahead of us, and they're going through their process now. And we are learning from them as to what the state is expecting in terms of the content of this section, which is helpful because it's actually fairly it's fairly detailed. I was kind of surprised today. I took a look at a city's AFFH section, and it was 40 pages long. So that was sobering.
Yeah.
Okay. Also, the requirement of updating the housing element triggers a requirement to review our safety element of the general plan and make sure that it adequately covers climate resilience, including sea level rise and wildfire hazards, and adopts the local hazard mitigation plan. Albany is in pretty good shape on this one because there is a fairly recent hazard mitigation plan, and the city has a fairly recent general plan. Where cities run into trouble here is if their general plan is 30 years old, and there are a number of cities in the Bay Area that are in that situation, they have to do major revisions to their housing element concurrently with their safety element, with their housing, major revisions to the safety element concurrently with the housing element. The other is the environmental justice element. If a city is identified as having a disadvantaged community within its boundaries, then it's required to adopt an environmental justice element. And this doesn't have to be a freestanding chapter of the plan. It at least has to be a set of policies that is woven through the plan that address things like equity, access to healthy food and parks and open space, and transportation, and government information, and so on. There are also a whole slew of housing bills that have been approved in the last few years. I didn't list them all here, but they're in the staff report. Many of these don't deal with the housing element per se, but they just deal with housing opportunities or housing issues in the community, and we need to be cognizant of those as we revise the element. So this process is a community-driven process. Our expectation is that we want to hear and need to hear from the public on the issues that we're going to be talking about. As you can imagine, rezoning on the scale that we're talking about is a big public process, and we're going to need to come up with some creative ways to engage the community. Hopefully by the end of this process, we'll be able to meet in person again. But for the time being, we're focusing on online engagement and community workshops that may be on Zoom. We are developing a housing website. We'll be conducting surveys and looking for online ways of providing information and feedback, meeting with developers, for-profit, nonprofit, housing advocates, and housing advocacy groups, and also looking at ways to, other creative ways of engaging the public. We are counting on the Planning Commission to really be the major vetting body as we go through this process. So this is the first of what may end up being about, I'll say 8 to 10 study sessions like this over the next year to 14 months to develop a draft document. Some will focus on housing and some may focus on the rezoning issues. We will get to know each other well by the end of this process. Our next steps are to come back to you with an evaluation of how the city has done in implementing its previous element, and then the needs assessment, which is really a kind of a data-driven presentation. We will then move into the constraints analysis and the site evaluation, and start probably around the summer in developing some of the proposals for consideration related to zoning and new sites. And the reason we're a little tentative on the time frame for this is that those RHNA numbers are still draft numbers. They're not going to be finalized until June of this year. And then there's an appeal process. And one of the consequences of the appeal process, it's a little bit like like whack-a-mole, because if one city's numbers go down, another city's numbers go up. The net change is still 441,000, the net number. So we won't really have final RHNA numbers until much later in 2021. We're planning on the assumption that our number is 1,114, and the city still could file an appeal. Other cities will, so it's a little fluid at this point. Regardless, assuming we're doing rezoning, there will be a CEQA component to this process where we're doing either a supplement or an addendum to the general plan EIR, looking at some new designations, certainly coming up with new policies. Our target is to have a draft element ready to submit to the state by roughly 14 months from now, April 2022. Now that's still 8 months ahead of the January 2023 deadline. The reason for that is that the process of getting state certification is a little bit iterative. They rarely certify your draft on the first time around. Typically, you submit the document to them while it is still a draft, and they will send you comments, and then you respond to those comments. This can take a couple of iterations. I think we were good last time. We only had one iteration of comments in the 2015 element, but as I think I mentioned in the staff report, the process prior to that took 6 years. So we don't want to repeat that. So I'm going to leave you with this slide and then open it up for questions, comments, and any comments from the public. Really any general thoughts or questions about the process and the housing element itself. Any thoughts from the commission on the RHNA, thoughts on potential housing opportunities and opportunity sites, housing needs in Albany, specific to Albany, ideas for community engagement, things you'd really like to see us do as part of this process, and ideas for future housing policies and programs to be considered. Now, I think we really are focusing on number one here, because obviously we could spend three hours if we got into all of this stuff. And this is kind of, food for thought more than anything. So I'm going to leave you with this, and I can bring the questions up again, but for now, we'll turn it back to the chair for some discussion and public comment. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mr. Miller. Seeing as it looks like we only have 1 or 2 public comments, why don't we go ahead and first pivot to public comment, and then we'll bring it back, and maybe Mr. Miller, you can put that slide back up and have both a sort of question and commentary deliberation by the commission. So with that, staff, can you please go ahead and open up public comment on this item?
We have one speaker, Eric Bieber. Eric, you have 3 minutes to speak starting now.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk on this. And I'll be fairly brief because I know it's early in the process. Again, I'm an Albany resident who's also a professor at UC Berkeley who teaches land use law and does research on housing element and land use law in California. Just some key points that I think, building on what was a really helpful presentation by your consultant, as well as the initial, the staff report up front. There's some significant consequences to the city of not having a compliant housing element, which basically means the ability of developers to proceed to do by right development without being consistent with the city's zoning code. So I think the stakes are pretty significant here, and getting this right is important. I had some tools that you might want to think about to try and meet what's going to be a very ambitious RHNA goal, regardless of what the appeals play out. I don't think you're going to get much below where you're at now in general. You might want to look at the probability of development for initial sites as something to consider in assessing the likelihood that a site will be developed, and using that as a metric to determine how many sites you need. I think that might help resolve concerns with HCD about feasibility, particularly for non-vacant sites. I think you might want to look at raising FAR overall throughout the city as a way to spread production more equitably and minimize the impacts on any one particular neighborhood or property from the changes. And same with looking to maybe allowing duplexes across the city, similar to the way that Berkeley has been looking at the issue. In terms of data and areas to look for constraints, I strongly encourage looking at timeframes for approvals for projects within the city. and also looking at the design review process in the city, and to the extent that that might be, in particular, an issue for smaller projects. I think there was mention of the University Village project that the university is pursuing. And I want to flag, I think there's some uncertainty as how those units, whether those units will count towards the city's RENA goals. It's going to depend a lot on the particulars of how the university designs the project and also how it leases it out. And that could be a big deal because that could be a few hundred units if it counts. So it might be helpful to have positive engagement with the university about the design in order to maybe ensure that it might count. I'd encourage doing concrete comparisons with neighboring cities to put our efforts in context. I think that will probably push us to be more ambitious, but I think it also will help with making the case for HCD. I do think HCD is going to be a lot more aggressive in reviewing these programs than it has in the past. I think that's going to raise the bar from us. And I'll leave it there for now. And I'm again happy to help engage with the consultant or the planning commission or with staff on these issues if there's any interest. Thanks very much.
Chris, are there any other public speakers?
I see no other hands up for public speaking at the moment.
Okay, last call. No other members of the public wishing to speak. We'll go ahead and close public comment and turn it back to the commission. Any commissioner want to kick things off here? Sure, Commissioner Pilch.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'll go ahead. I have a number of questions, so bear with me. I'll try to get through them quickly. So going back to one of the first slides, Mr. Miller, about the percentage of units that have been built in the current cycle, and I think it was already shown that I don't was that for the region or for Albany that we were up already at 125% of above moderate units. Was that already for partial?
Yeah, sorry, that was for the 9-county Bay Area, for the whole region.
All right, so we've already exceeded early in the cycle then. Are you able to hear me? Okay, good. Looks like I'm paused a little bit. So that's remarkable. Do you think that is somewhat a result of the fact that in the 2010s we had a large increase in rental prices and property values, and quite an extraordinary increase, such that building the same size unit is now much less affordable in 2021 than it was in 2010. Do those economics factor in?
I think part of it is the economics, and part of it is there was a pretty big consensus, at least in the housing community, that the last RENA number was pretty low and that it should have been higher. And so part of the reason that a large percentage has been accomplished is the number itself was fairly low, which is one of the reasons the increase seems so high now.
Okay. It does seem like it's and don't get me wrong, I want to make sure we build units for all of our community, but it seems like it's a complex equation with the values going up, perhaps the housing stock getting squeezed, the population going up. All these factors seem to weigh into this. I guess the reason for my question is what I'm getting at is can one build those very low income units and or build units such that we can meet very low income and low income targets by just building market rate units, or is it pretty much a given that those have to be affordable housing, which will need some subsidies in order to be built?
Yeah, it depends. The low income units, some market rate housing can satisfy that need. The very low would be almost certainly, it would need a subsidy. unless it's like a junior accessory dwelling unit where somebody is just taking a bedroom in their house and making it an independent unit. Typically, the rents on those are going to be above that 30% threshold for a very low income household. So there's a little wiggle room, but if we can produce data showing that we have rental units that are market rate that are less than, say, $900 a month, we may be able to count some, but almost always those are subsidized units in the very low.
Yeah. Yeah, and the very low seems challenging because finding the money, the grants or what have you to build that subsidized housing can be a big job, or we have to get clever, as you said, with counting bedrooms and such like that. I don't have an opinion on that. I'm just kind of turning that over in my mind. Next, you said that you were showing cycles 3, 4, 5, and 6, but you weren't showing cycles 1 and 2. But I got confused there because I thought you said that this process started back in 69.
Yeah, it did. The prior cycles, I don't know that they didn't do the same RENA process in the 70s and early 80s. I think the actual process of taking a number from the state, assigning it to ABAG, and then ABAG allocating it, to be honest, I'm not completely sure how that was done. My first housing element was in 1990, so that's my history with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Next, it seems like some of the new legislation is, perhaps inadvertently disfavors communities like Albany that are all built out with some of the requirements there. So hopefully, we'll be able to show that our opportunities in redevelopment of parcels and not development of vacant land, because we have almost none, as you mentioned. Does it seem, would that be fair to say to you that the cities like Albany, maybe just the boilerplate state language doesn't fit Albany all that well?
I would absolutely agree with that. And I think what we'll need to do is show that the city has successfully developed housing on those sites. So there are a couple of good examples of infill that have happened that we can point to on smaller sites and on sites that were formerly commercial. I wish there were more, but I think there are a few, and that's a good start. And we can also, I think we had to do this in the last housing element as well, which is to also look at we looked at El Cerrito and Berkeley on San Pablo Avenue to demonstrate that, yes, there were 10,000, 12,000, 14,000 square foot properties that were getting developed at 25, or actually at more like 50 to 70 units per acre, and that would be a reasonable thing to presume in Albany. So we will need to look for real world examples if we're not sticking to that half acre non-vacant standard.
Yeah. Okay. Just two more questions. Measure K, are you familiar with Measure K, Mr. Miller?
Can you remind me again?
I can speak to Measure K. It's a voter initiative that was passed in 1994 that reduced density on Albany Hill. And as it would relate to our efforts now, it specifically impacts development feasibility on the undeveloped 11-acre parcel.
Right.
Yeah, and I think we'll need to start studying that right away. In fact, the last council considered putting something on the ballot to reform Measure K or change Measure K because of the recognition that we wanted to get dense housing on Albany Hill. But I think there wasn't the time to do it because it would require CEQA analysis. But if that's the case, we probably want to consider, starting on that part sooner than later. So that's something to keep in mind. And then finally, and I don't know if this is a question for staff or Mr. Miller or both, but how do you see the timeline for the San Pablo specific plan and the housing element submission? Where do you see those timelines being?
Yeah, so I can speak to that. We anticipate the specific plan effort concluding in 2021, and obviously we're going to continue working on the housing element well into 2022. So the intent is to complete the specific plan first, and then complete the housing element. But certainly the change come about from the specific plan will help to inform some of the policies in the new housing element.
Yeah, it seems like there'll be very much there'll be concerns will dovetail very much in those two efforts. So I think that does it for me for now. So thanks for indulging me.
Commissioner Donaldson.
Sure. I think I have some questions. Maybe I'll go ahead, Barry, and maybe you should put your questions you asked us first, but I'll just go ahead with some of my thoughts, and then maybe we'll come back to that list of questions you had for us. Let me think here. Let me look at some of my notes. One thing I noticed right away in the staff report, you said on page 4 that the Department of Finance has 6,947 housing units in Albany, but our housing element says there's way more than that. Our housing element says there's 7,833 units. So I thought, well,
it's the University Village. That's this difference is University Village isn't counted in the state numbers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for pointing that out. It's a good point.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Again, I had the same thought. I think someone else raised it as well. Maybe Eric Bieber did, about the proposed housing in University Village, and if that can count, they're talking about a lot of units. And so I think his comment is it would be good for us to work with the university to watch closely what they're doing and encourage them to do design work, so we might be able to count some or all of those units. And in fact, some of them might well be affordable, given the income what graduate students are paid. I was thinking about that, and then a similar thing is when do things are if we have a project that's being built like now, when does it get counted in which housing element? And is there any let's see, if it gets built before 2023, it won't count toward the cycle 6. It has to count toward cycle 5. Is that right? And can there be some carryover?
Yeah, so there's some gray areas, and I think this is something that I myself will need to look into more to get a good answer. I can tell you that projects that are under construction now that will be completed, that will have certificates of occupancy before January 31st, 2023, we almost certainly will not be able to count any projects in that category. Not being able to count it, it's sort of a mixed bag. We are going to say that we accomplished the development of that housing in this cycle. And HCD considers not only how you're planning for the future, but how you're doing on implementing your element. So it's a good thing for us to be able to say, hey, we built 62 units of very low income or affordable housing during this cycle, in making the case for why it's realistic that we're going to do it in the future. So we need actually to show some housing that's affordable built during the cycle. It's actually quite important that we can do that.
Yeah. But I guess when the RENA numbers were developed, there wasn't any consideration about how well the city had done in this cycle. How would affect their the numbers for the next cycle. Doesn't sound to me like that was considered. Is that right? In other words,
well, I don't know that it wasn't intentionally, it wasn't directly considered. I would say indirectly insofar as, the factors like income and the whole concept of a high opportunity area or a high resource area kind of factors into what kind of construction and development has been happening in the community. So there's a sort of an indirect factoring in of that.
yeah, okay. All right. Oh, let's see here. If we have to do some rezoning, some zoning changes, and maybe even some general plan amendments, then do those have to be done and on the books before we submit the draft of the housing element, or sort of what's the timing of that, or can they be underway? Maybe if we do a general plan amendment, can the EIR still be underway when we finish the draft? I'm worried about schedule already.
Yeah, no, it's really excellent questions. And again, it's a little bit of a mixed bag in the answer. You have actually 3 years to complete your rezoning and your plan amendments beyond the submittal of the housing element, but there are strings attached to that, like allowing the housing by right once you get the rezoning in place. And certainly from a CEQA perspective, I think we will want to have at least the analysis of the rezoning completed. The analysis of adopting the housing element. Otherwise, you are deferring some of the stuff to you're putting that burden on the future development. So these are some things we're going to be looking at and getting you better answers to in the coming months. The rules are changing pretty much all the time. But I know with respect to housing, there is some allowance for doing some rezoning and plan amendments beyond the submittal date.
Okay. With respect to the RENA numbers and the sort of appeal process and the debate over the allocations, it seems to me like that city council would be the main agency involved in that. And it said in there that our city council had already signed a letter with 14 other mayors to, express concerns about the RENA numbers or something like that in the process. I guess my question is there a role for planning and zoning in that? I guess of course goes to Ann and to staff maybe, or I don't know. I'm a little worried about about the numbers floating around while we're trying to do the plan, and how long that might continue to happen. Can have them continue to float, if you understand what I mean. Mm-hmm.
Sure. I understand. You'd like some assurance on what that final number is, and I think from what we know already, it's we're going to have that information here pretty soon. The letter that you referenced, I think that was done about 6 or 7 months ago, and that was when I think everyone was in a bit of state of shock over the numbers coming out, and so there was a collective reaction, a gasp, if you will, over looking at that and those allocations. I think ABAG is making adjustments. There are going to be some adjustments. We'll continue to see these numbers shift. So I think we'll be in reasonable shape going forward.
Yeah, I think I heard that a huge number of cities in the San Diego region appealed their RENA numbers, and all of the appeals were denied, is what I heard. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That was Southern California Association of Government, SCAG. Yeah, that process just wrapped up a couple of weeks ago, and I hadn't heard that it was 100% denial, but yeah, they were almost all being denied, and their numbers were even larger than the Bay Area's, so it was quite a shock for them as well.
Regarding affordability questions, I have, there's a phrase in here called affordable by design. and that got my attention. Does that, how, I've always thought that in order for something to be qualified as affordable, you needed to have data on what the rents actually were, and what you had to show that the people were eligible for affordable housing, or that it was affordable at any given time. If it's affordable by design, does that mean that we might be able to see some homes that go in just by virtue of their square footage or something like that? They count as one of our affordable categories? Or is the city going to be obligated to gather rental information every year on it and prove that those units are still affordable? I'm thinking here particularly of ADUs.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the one category where HCD has been pretty good about accepting a local argument that an ADU is affordable by design, because there's typically not a rent restriction on an ADU. There can be, but there usually isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly, again, with the junior ADUs and the smaller ADUs, if you can show them some rent data, then they'll generally accept that, at least at the low level. This is what I was saying earlier, not so much at the very low level, but that band from, the lower income band, you can still have rents that are $1,500, $1,800 a month and consider that to be affordable to low income.
Right. Right. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, typically that will work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's good. That's good to know. Let's see. I think that might be it. Oh, no, here's something else. Affirmatively furthering fair housing and moving people. What comes to my mind are rent vouchers. I don't know why that is, but it seems to me that Section 8, the old Section 8 problem, now the housing, I forgot what they're called exactly. The rent vouchers are a good thing in that they do allow very low income people or low income people to actually get integrated more broadly into a mix of housing. And I'm wondering if there's any role here in the housing element, because I have heard there's talk that the Biden administration is thinking of increasing that program, which is drastically underfunded now. Is there any role here in the sort of a rent voucher approach that could be useful in doing the housing element, or any future here?
So I think you categorized it correctly as an affirmatively furthering fair housing issue. Yeah. It's not so much a RHNA issue because the units are already there.
Right.
But you're making them more available to very low income households by increasing the number of Section 8 vouchers. And so in terms of the numeric issue that we're looking at with the zoning and stuff, it's not really going to, be a factor, but certainly for meeting the housing needs of the community, it would be. I'm sure that there will be programs that we develop that look for ways to expand the availability and the acceptance of Section 8 vouchers.
Yeah, housing choice vouchers. I think that's right. What it's called now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So we might have policies in the housing element about that, but it's not going to be something that's going to be very helpful in looking at how we're going to achieve the RHNA numbers. All right. Yeah. Okay. Those are my questions right now. And probably at some point it might be good for you to put your slide back up to so we can address the more general questions you had. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Momin?
I think you're muted, Mohammed. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No.
You don't seem to be muted, but you're not audible for some reason.
All right, why don't we come back to you in a second? I think you're having some audio challenges. Commissioner McLeod, did you want to jump in?
Sure, I can go next. I guess, I mean, there's a lot of things to think about and consider. One of my first questions was just, how is a unit defined? And that, I mean, we've talked about junior ADUs. We have 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom units. So a unit in terms of RENA would be any one of those things. Is that correct?
Yeah, typically it has to have cooking facilities and a bathroom. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a full kitchen, but there have to be cooking facilities and a bathroom inside the unit. So a junior ADU typically would count. There might be some situations where it wouldn't. An ADU will almost always count. Where it gets really kind of frustrating with HCD is shared housing typically counts only as 1 unit. So if you have co-housing, it's really hard to start putting, counting things where there are multiple households in a single unit unless the building is structured to have independent kitchens or cooking facilities. And yeah, there are a lot of gray areas with them, but the general rule of thumb is, does it have a kitchen? Does it have a bathroom?
But it doesn't really distinguish between a 3-bedroom unit and a 1-bedroom unit.
Not for the purposes of the RENA. It would make a difference in terms of meeting some of your special needs if you find that there's a need for large family housing and you're providing 3-bedroom or 4-bedroom units. That's a positive step, but not in terms of showing HCD that you've met the requirement to accommodate the number of units that you need to. They're not going to really drill down to, are they studios or 4 bedrooms? I mean, is it a housing unit, and is it affordable to a particular income group? So yeah, a studio will be more affordable than a 4-bedroom unit.
Yeah, I guess there's some sort of imbalance, and you're counting units, but you're not counting people. It's sort of a disconnect. So I find that odd. And I find it also odd that you could have a whole, I mean, in terms of affordability too, a 3-bedroom affordable unit might be housing more people or, helping more people than a 1-bedroom affordable unit. So I think that's also an odd disconnect, but I guess that's, part of the policy that we have to deal with, nothing that we can really address at our level. I was thinking about upzoning, and will part of what we're doing or what you're doing as a consultant being assessing how the upzoning would increase the number of potential units? So let's say we were to go to, allow duplexes everywhere. Would that be part of your role to assess how many more units that might make possible, or?
Yes, it will, but you picked the most difficult example. If it's
Well, you're welcome.
Well, if it's rezoning to allow duplexes, that's really tricky because that requires some assumption about how many folks in the city are going to opt to do that. Whereas taking a site on San Pablo Avenue and saying instead of a 2.0 FAR, we're going to allow a 4.0 FAR, or allow 65 feet instead of 45 feet. Those are easier to measure and to quantify because it's an individual site and there's an envelope that you're changing. But if it's changing the allowable use within an existing building, that becomes trickier. So yeah.
Okay.
But yes, that is part of this process.
Okay. And then how will our effort on San Pablo Avenue dovetail with what you're doing? So for example, like you just mentioned, if we say, okay, let's go to 5 stories, 6 stories, 7 stories, reduce the FAR, eliminate the FAR, or whatever, would you be studying the effect of that also? Or is that independent of what you're doing?
We're kind of working in tandem on this, and the San Pablo work is a little bit ahead of where the housing element is. This is, literally the very first meeting for this project, and there's been a lot of work that's already been done on that. So I'm kind of coming into that in the middle, and we'll participate with staff and with folks working on that, so we can make sure we're all kind of moving in the same direction. They now have some information about how many units we're short and may consider that in terms of the recommendations that come out of that specific plan to close that gap as much as possible. And Ann, I don't know if you want to add anything to how we're synchronizing our work, but we're all working together, I think, is part of the answer.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I don't have anything more to add.
Well, that's great. I would really appreciate it as, kind of seeing the impact of our various scenarios on San Pablo Avenue. I've thought for a while that the RHNA process and requirements should be driving our policy on San Pablo Avenue in terms of height limits, maxing out height limits, reducing parking requirements, reducing the constraints, essentially, is what it's been called in this RHNA process. So I think seeing the effects of different scenarios would be very good, and it would be very helpful for the public to know what that would look like and how that will help us meet our RHNA targets. It's one of the reasons I've been, advocating for reducing constraints, parking, raising height limits. I think we should reduce or eliminate the FAR, among other things. So, and then it's not just limited to the San Pablo Avenue corridor. I think we should be looking at the Solano corridor. And also, like has been noted, the R3 zoning area seems to be quite undeveloped. Granted, we have a lot of small lots, and I don't know what we could be thinking about in terms of aggregating lots or a redevelopment agency or something like that that would help facilitate grouping lots into, slightly more efficient, effective projects. I don't know if that's something that we are going to be considering going forward, or if that's part of the discussion is some sort of redevelopment agency. I think there was something in the past that the city has done. And I was also thinking about Measure K. I thought the process was kind of underway to get it onto the ballot at some point, and I guess it was not timely enough for the last election.
That's correct. There were issues when the city sponsors a ballot initiative. The city is also responsible for doing the CEQA analysis prior to making that effort to get it on the ballot. And there are timing requirements as far as doing that work, having the council take action, getting it to the Board of Elections so it can go on the ballot. So for all of those reasons, it wasn't feasible to get it on the 2020 ballot.
And are we pointing towards the next election to have it on the ballot? Because I think it would have to be on the next. I don't know when we might have some by-elections in a year, but maybe are we talking about 2 years?
I think thematically it may be a slightly longer horizon. This is certainly going to be a big discussion for the commission as we go through the housing element update process. But the initial thinking was that the CEQA that's done as part of the housing element would also encompass the Measure K effort. So you'd effectively have the environmental review as well as an explicit policy within the updated housing element. And that would pave the way for this to go on likely the 2024 ballot.
Wow, that's a ways out. And then how that would count then towards our next RHNA cycle. That would be a little bit, I guess there was that 3-year period where zoning changes could still be adopted that it might fall into. But I thought that was an excellent site and an excellent opportunity to build at the lower half and in trade-off for more open space. That that one project that came before us, I thought was pretty awful. But in terms of how much land it was using and the effect on the land. So yeah, it'd be very encouraging to try to get the development concentrated at the bottom of the hill. Other thoughts?
I wanted to just speak to one thing that you had mentioned
Yeah.
prior to Measure K. You had talked about two different policies, and I just wanted to add a little bit of clarity.
Okay.
One of which was lot consolidation and identifying that we obviously have some smaller sites which present their own constraints and limitations for development. Within the existing housing element, we do have lot consolidation policies, and I would expect that as we go through this update process, we'll be reevaluating that. And if there is some interest of the commission to modify that policy, we can certainly work towards that as part of the update process. And then you had mentioned redevelopment. Redevelopment was a tool that was statewide, and it was dissolved on the 1st of January 2012. So it's been gone for a while. And, you know, with that, with an agency, you know, the state would, you know, the cities would have money in working with the state on redevelopment, but that's obviously gone away, and I don't think it's coming back
Okay.
soon.
Yeah, and then I was curious about the UC project, because the way I've understood it planned at the moment is that it was going to be 4-bedroom dorm suites. So it's really not clear how that would fit into future calculations, or whether it would even be able to be included in what we're going to be counting. So yeah, you know, it'd be great to talk to UC, and you know, it's like steering an oil tanker though with them. So it may already be too late. You know, but
We are talking to them just so you're
offer an opinion.
Yeah, we're in regular communication with them. So
Okay, well, maybe we should see what they're currently planning and just evaluate whether that fits in or not, because that could be a huge number of units that could be beneficial to us. So I think that's it. But I think in general, the upzoning across the city would, in my mind, would be a good idea. And it's, you know, and there are a lot of factors there too. FAR, whether that's too restrictive, could be reconsidered. And certainly, if we're upzoning San Paulo Avenue, the R3 zone could certainly be brought up proportionally. I think it should be, but that's not part of our current San Pablo Avenue specific plan. So we'd have to have another process for that. And I think we should also be looking at Brighton and Solano Avenue. I think Solano Avenue has a lot of potential. I mean, maybe another story above what it is, or two possibly. You know, I think more density, in my mind, is going to help our city. I think it's an economic development opportunity. I think it brings more people to our local businesses and creates a more thriving local community. So, you know, and it also makes a more sustainable community to have people living near where they work. So I think this is all a good thing. Albany is kind of a textbook example for where you should be increasing density. We want people living near where we work. We want people living near jobs. We don't want to be excluding housing here and forcing development into the hinterlands, out onto agricultural lands, as has been the paradigm for the last 30 years, 40 years, building on, you know, vacant farmland, or just building on farmland or in the hinterlands. It creates a lot of congestion, traffic, you know, in a climate action kind of scenario. I think building housing here is a very positive action. So, you know, I think this is a good process, and I think it's a timely thing to be doing. And, you know, it's very supportive of moving it forward.
Commissioner Momin, is your audio back up and running? Oh, it doesn't look like it is.
No.
Okay, well, I'll jump in the meantime. I have just a couple additional thoughts, and I don't have a whole lot of additional commentary that hasn't already been said by other commissioners, but generally speaking, I really agree with a lot of the commentary, and a lot of the same questions that I had have been answered. One of the remaining questions that I have, and I feel like you touched on this, but I still don't feel like I have it 100%, as it relates to ADUs. Now that ADUs are allowed effectively citywide, and really more than one ADU under state law could be plausible per most parcels in Albany, how do we factor that into RHNA? Because obviously the landscape and the laws are very different today moving forward to our next housing element than they were in the last one that we adopted. So I'm just wondering, do we assume carte blanche, full leverage of state ADUs across the city? Is it a proportion of that? What are the types of factors that we're looking at in terms of figuring out how many we can assume and how many we can't?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's driven by two things. It's driven by the data that we can provide on how many have been permitted and are likely to be permitted based on the trends and what HCD will allow. And there is a bit of back and forth with whoever our state reviewer is about the number of units. I mean, we're not going to say something egregious like we're going to build 100 ADUs a year, but actually that would get us almost to our 1,100. But I think if the city is, what we did last time is, we said we are allowing ADUs. Here's what our track record has been. We're implementing all of these programs that are much more supportive of ADUs, that are educating the community about the value, how easy it is to build them, and taking, it's laying out a whole roadmap for more ADUs. Therefore, we think we're going to double our production in the next 8 years. And they agreed. Okay, we will accept that. Even though you're only producing 4 per year, you will produce 8 per year in the next 8, however many years, and allow us to count that. But you can't just say you're going to do it. You really need to show some data and some trend data. We will most likely do a survey of some kind as part of this, of existing ADUs, and try to, because the other issue is, who are the ADUs serving? We may be permitting ADUs, but we don't know that they're actually being rented, or that they're being rented by lower income households. So it gets a little bit complicated if you try to put too many of your eggs in one basket with the ADUs. But yeah, I mean, certainly relative to the last housing element, I think we counted, I'm trying to remember what the number was. It was like 40 ADUs of the total, for the 335 that we were assigned. I think we said 40 were going to be ADUs. So my sense is that it'll be double that, if not more than double. But again, we're going to have to make the case for why we think that's reasonable.
I do also feel like there's an argument to be made on ADUs, not just looking at past precedents, but I mean, in my sort of day job experience, at least, there is a, the marketing has kicked in on ADUs. They're more widely known to the general population. I think more and more people buying homes in Albany are aware of ADUs. And I do think there's sort of an upward trajectory in the market's interest in ADUs, not just what did we do last year, what did we do the year before, and sort of making some assumptions based on that. So I think, looking at surrounding jurisdictions, ADU production, but I've seen a big uptick since the recent state law changes too, and the number of ADUs coming in. So I think we have to factor that in as well. But absolutely. Okay, thanks. That's really helpful to hear on that. And I do think ADUs are a really good sort of pot for us to do sort of gentle increase in density in terms of our RHNA numbers. I mean, I do think ADUs will help us get some of the net new delta. I think ADUs are a really great bucket to be looking at. And I think they're a way we've seen a lot of ADUs incorporated incredibly successfully into projects where, we're told on the commission, part of this project's an ADU, you can't opine on it. Here's the part you can. And it's been really great to see so many coming through. With that said, I do also think one of the other things we should really be looking at when we're looking at our housing element is, when looking basically at our zoning map, I think we should be looking around our borders and really looking at our zoning requirements and how they weave into sort of the fabric of the adjacent communities zoning controls. I've always thought it's very strange when, people live out in the cities. You don't know you necessarily have crossed a border, but sometimes you can tell by the way the buildings look. And I think this is an opportunity for us to really rethink our borders and maybe more naturally kind of weave them together. And if, El Cerrito or Berkeley has higher density on those borders, both, not just San Pablo, I know we've already discussed that as it relates to the San Pablo plan, but also in our more, low slung residential areas, really looking at what the adjacent densities are, and especially with Berkeley going to an allowance of fourplexes potentially, and how does that impact on our sort of eastern and southern borders. And I'm not as familiar with the El Cerrito zoning is sort of towards the hills in the Albany El Cerrito border, but really looking at that as a bit of a guide to think about, do we want to make any zoning changes in terms of capacity that's allowed? And that to me would be a very reasonable, pragmatic approach to looking at potentially making changes that are a little less obvious than the San Pablo plan or the Albany Hill plan or the UC Village plan. It might be another way for us to sort of thread that needle a little bit and looking at some additional capacity. I think other than that was pretty much it for sort of any additional commentary that I have outside of what other commissioners said. The one last thing I would say is on Solano. For me, Solano to me is a little bit of the precious gem of Albany. And so I'm always have very torn, mixed feelings about talking about upzonings or making dramatic changes on Solano, because I do think a lot of the success of Solano is sort of the character of our commercial corridors, sort of the lack of curb cuts on Solano, really the active commercial corridors. And I think there's certainly a way to balance some increased density, but I think it would also be a good opportunity to look at, are there any other zoning constraints on Solano relative to residential development, particularly on upper floors, that might be precluding, the residential may be allowed, but are there other zoning requirements that really makes residential impractical? And so we haven't really seen that. And it may not necessarily help our RHNA numbers of saying we're moving the needle on allowing for increased capacity, but it may pragmatically move the needle on where we see people, adding in a couple units here and there. And I'm just not on the top of my head familiar enough with all of our zoning controls on Solano to take a look at that. But again, I feel like going through a housing element, it's a good time to sort of pull the covers all the way back, really re-examine all of our different rules. And I think it would be a good time to look at things like, parking ratios, open space, requirements, all of those things that sometimes end up, the FAR being a unintended hindrance to the production of housing or conversion of, vacant commercial spaces to residential. So that's it. That's my comments. Maybe we'll loop back to Commissioner Moman. I feel bad you're not able to chime in here, but is your audio working? No.
No. You could dial in on telephone for the audio, if that was an option.
Any change?
Oh, there we go.
We can hear you.
We gotcha.
Okay, good.
Yay.
Yay.
Finally, thank you.
11th hour. We just saved the best for last here. Please go ahead.
Oh my God. Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Miller. That was a great presentation. When I read the staff report, I had a lot of questions, and many of them got answered by your presentation, and many of them remaining, have been answered by the questions that my fellow commissioners have asked. I still have some observations and some remaining questions. Similar to Commissioner Pilch, I am concerned about very low-income housing. We have, about 44% low-income and very low-income housing requirement, and 15%. We have per zoning code 15% inclusionary housing requirement, and so I'm hoping that whatever housing development occurs in the next decade, 15% of that could be taken care of the 15% of affordable housing or low income and very low income housing can be taken care of by that 15% inclusionary housing. But we still have more than 27, 28% of housing remaining that would be very low income, and we'll have to find ways how we can develop that. I'm familiar with affordable housing project done by nonprofits, but those are mostly developed on city-owned lands, and I don't think we have remaining city-owned land that could be used for very low-income affordable housing project. And so it is, I think, a big challenge for us to not just the financing, but also finding land for that kind of housing development is a big challenge. And I'm not clear, or I'm not sure if there is any way, in defining any site, earmarking any site for that kind of development, even if the city doesn't own that. And so, yeah, I would like to have your opinion on that. For the moderate income and low income, I think we can look at rezoning some of the areas. I'm very curious what kind of innovative housing approaches we can explore. I recently heard Sacramento has ended the single family zoning last month, and they are now allowing fourplex buildings on all their parcels that are under single family housing. I think that might be too extreme for Albany, but I'm surely hopeful that we can look at R2 zones for that kind of development. Currently, R2 zone allows 2 units if the parcel is larger than 3,500 square feet. I'm curious if we can link that somehow with very low income housing, and if we incentivize very low income housing on R2 zones with, let's say, we allow 4 plexes or 6 plexes on those parcels, and if some of those can be dedicated to low income housing or very low income housing, it would be really useful to explore that option. I had questions about rezoning effort and how that could be documented in our response to housing element update. Commissioner McLeod already asked that question. If we rezone any site, and if we upzone that for certain density, we don't know which parcel would be developed and which would not. And so it is, as you answered, Mr. Miller, it is difficult to assess that what kind of housing potential we would have after upzoning those areas. Similarly, I have questions about density bonus. We have set density bonus recently. I think state has increased that density bonus to 50%, up to 50%. And so some of our properties on San Pablo Avenue or even elsewhere might use that density bonus law and go for a higher density and higher height. Is there any way to assess the result of that, and how can we document that in our response to housing element update? That also, I think, we need to study. And then I'm not very clear about carryover parcels and small parcels. You mentioned that if we include carryover parcels in our housing element update, they will have to allow them to be developed by right. And most of these parcels are along San Pablo Avenue, and that includes small parcels also. And so you mentioned that we would need some kind of development standards that would respond to our community's development aims and also neighborhood concerns and things like that. So I'm wondering how we can do that as part of San Pablo Avenue specific plan. In the next stage, I think I understand that in the next stage of San Pablo Avenue specific plan, we would be looking at design standards and design guidelines. And so if we include some of those properties and formulate design guidelines and design standards for those properties, would we be, first of all, allowed to do that if we want to include those properties, carryover properties into our current next housing element update? And if we are allowed, would that be a good situation? Would that be useful? And then you mentioned in your report that the third chapter of our housing element update would be needs assessment, and we would be looking at a lot of factors, including demographics and things like that. I understand, I'm not sure basically, if the allocation by income groups as given by ABAG, is that fixed? And if it is fixed, then what impact does the needs assessment does on the housing allocation by income groups? Or can we do some adjustment to that? Or is there any possibility that after we go through the needs assessment exercise and we realize that we don't need so many very low income housing units, would we be allowed to adjust that? And then lastly, I would like to see some precedents. You mentioned that South California cities are 1 year ahead of us. And I'm wondering if there are any small cities, similar to Albany, that also are short on inventory sites, and what kind of strategies they have employed. It would be interesting to study that and learn some lessons from them. Maybe we can emulate some of those strategies in our case. Yeah, I think that's all.
Great questions and comments. And I wrote some of them down and thought I could respond to a couple of them. Some of them may require some more research and listening to the streaming of this so I can make sure I get all of them. Okay. But you raised a lot of really good points in your comments. And starting with the first issue about the very low income. I think you pointed out one of the fundamental flaws in this process, which is that we're identifying sites for very low income, where very low income housing could be built, but we don't have the financial resources to necessarily allow that housing to be, or I shouldn't say allow, but to make it more realistic that housing will be built. And so, one of the challenges is we identify these sites and we say this site is available for very low, but then someone comes in and wants to put market rate housing there, and typically we permit the market rate housing. One of the things about this process is we actually can't show that we've allowed market rate housing if the result is that we can no longer meet our RHNA. And what that essentially does is it requires that we have a buffer of extra sites, and we actually need to provide a little more than what our numbers are so that we provide some flexibility to the market. But we still end up back at the position that you're describing, which is, well, we're not going to meet our, we're not going to be able to build 300 units of very low if we don't have financial assistance or the funding sources at the state level, at the federal level, or in the nonprofit community to make that housing real. And that's been the big reason that those numbers have always exceeded on the above moderate and never even gotten halfway there on the very low. So this is bigger problem than Albany. I mean, this is a structural problem with the whole way we build housing in California. And we are, we're working as best we can at the local level with the constraints that we have. The state, is not going to ding the city necessarily for not meeting its very low production numbers, but they will if we don't at least provide the land capacity to reach that number. So that is embedded in that. You had asked a question about the carryover parcels and the small parcels, and this is something we're going to have to do a little more research on. One thing I will say is there were a lot of parcels on San Pablo Avenue that we did not count last time that we will count this time. So I think in some ways we're lucky. For example, we didn't count the Albany Bowl last time, and we can count it. We don't have some of those constraints on those properties now, and I do think we will need to make the case for why some of those non-vacant sites are viable, because they're the only option that we have. You had asked about the needs assessment. Unfortunately, what we learn in that needs assessment can't change the outcome of the RENA. They've looked at the same census data and the same demographic data at the regional level when they made those assignments. So they've already considered the income distribution in each city and how they assign. And actually, if you have more very low currently, they'll give you more above moderate in the future. It's essentially a balancing formula. So that's that's part of the equation that they use. Really good questions about the specific plan and by right development. I think one of the hopes for the specific plan is that it will include some pretty prescriptive development standards so that we can allow more by right development, so that we don't have to have an EIR and a planning commission hearing and multiple hearings to get through approval of a project. If it comes in and it checks all the boxes and it meets all the requirements, it's approved. That's what the state is looking for. That's the reason you do a specific plan and include those design standards in the plan. So I think that is where we're headed, on this. And yeah, we may carry some of those sites forward because we are allowing by right development in the specific plan for certain project types or projects that fit certain dimensional and design standards. So we will create that path forward, but then there's also the option for those who want to build outside the box, so to speak, to go through a planning commission process or another process to build something different or bigger. So definitely that is where we're headed. I hope that answers some of your questions. I know there were more. I thought your idea about the incentives for the fourplexes in the R2, that's a great idea. That's exactly the kind of thing we're looking for, is creative ideas to incentivize the addition of a unit. Like, you get to build another unit, but it has to be a very low income unit where you wouldn't be able to build one now. And there are deed restrictions or rent restrictions that may go with that. Those are the incremental steps that get you closer to real results and real production that you may not get if you just say there's the one site in our city and leave it at that. So good comments and good food for thought.
Good, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I know everyone's kind of gone through once. If there aren't any other follow-up questions here, I do see there, it looks like there's a public speaker who's raised their hand since we've closed public comment, but just for the sake of these remote hearings are a little tough. If everyone's all right, I'd like to go ahead and just reopen public comment to take the one gentleman who has his hand raised, it looks like. Chris, if you wouldn't mind helping to reopen public comment on this item before we move on to the next item, that would be great.
Sure. The next speaker, Derek Sagehorn, you have 3 minutes to speak, beginning now.
Hi, this is Derek Sagehorn. I'm from East Bay for Everyone, which is a land use and housing advocacy organization throughout the East Bay. We are going to be participating in 36 different housing elements processes throughout Alameda and Contra Costa County over the next 2 years. And we're looking forward to engaging on Albany's housing element update. I'm really heartened by a lot of the comments I heard from the Planning Commission this evening. Some really great ideas. I really like how different commissioners are looking for ways to meet these goals. Albany is a great place to add more housing, especially affordable housing. And it's clear that with the San Pablo specific plan, the move towards more objective design standards, as well as thinking about density bonuses and where to really get these affordable units, I think that this body at least is on the right track. And I'm looking forward to continuing to work with community, with different advocates in the environmental and affordable housing community to help you as a body identify these sites and meet the goals that are put down by the Council of Governments as well as HCD. So again, looking forward to continuing to engage and keep up the great work. Thank you.
With that, Chris, just one last pass. It doesn't look like there are any other hands raised. Are there any other members of public comment who wish to speak before we move along? All right.
I don't see it. Yeah.
Seeing none, then we'll go ahead and close public comment again. And if there aren't any other questions or comments a few more. Okay, Commissioner McLeod.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit on Commissioner Momin's comments. Just one in particular, he was talking about the state density bonus law. There's some discussion, we just set some minimum standards on San Pablo Avenue and then we let state density bonus law do the rest. Now, state density bonus law is basically a wild card as far as I can tell. You're not sure what anyone's going to ask for. You're not sure how many units they're going to get beyond what's allowed. So I guess my question is that state density bonus law, whatever result might be above and beyond our zoning standard, would not be counted towards RHNA. Is that correct?
Unfortunately, that's correct. Yeah. No, HCD does not allow you to count the density bonus increment as part of meeting your RHNA.
Yeah, well, it seems like it's impossible to define what you would get with state density bonus law, and that's part of the problem, right? So I think that's a hazard or a risk in just saying state density bonus law will allow us to hit our, maybe our housing element targets or our density targets or whatever redevelopment targets we're looking for on San Pablo. So, I just think we need to keep that in mind as we're going forward with this RHNA process and the specific plan in tandem. So that's it.
Great, thank you. Any other last call items here or discussion? Okay, seeing none, then we'll go ahead and close this informational item. Thank you, Mr. Miller. We look forward to more over the coming months and years, I guess.
Yeah, good presentation.
See everybody later.
Yes, thank you.
That's right.
Next up on our agenda is item 7-2, Parliamentary Procedures. This item, we will discuss parliamentary procedures for applicant video streaming during public hearings.
Yes. So as you know, we've been doing the Zoom meetings now, coming up on close to a year, and we've been working through just a general framework that our city clerk established. And after the last meeting, Commissioner Pilchhead asked about the feasibility of applicants during our Planning and Zoning Commission meetings having their video turned on so that the commission can see their faces. Currently, it's just a box on the screen. And so we checked with the city clerk. Part of why she's cautious was to avoid Zoom bombing, and thus far we've been quite lucky. So knock on wood. I think, though, for the purposes of the commission review and discussion, this is really just a parliamentary procedure. If you're comfortable with that, and I think that if the consensus is that you are, we would then work with the applicant, first of all, to ask for their consent if they're comfortable with that. Some are, some aren't. And then, depending upon that, also determining, they can let us know whether they want their architect to be the designee or if the homeowner themselves wants to do their presentation. We want to be kind of cautious about managing the panelist component because obviously sometimes property owners and architects speak, and you can get a lot of faces on the screen. So that's just the general framework of what we're leaning towards. But of course, this is up to the commission. It's your meeting and your procedures.
I'll just jump in with some initial thoughts that I have. I think it's working quite well, all things considered right now, in terms of our public comment. I do think there have been some applicants where they could have benefited from having especially a project sponsor versus a member of the public, where they maybe would have benefited from having a presentation that they could present. And I would certainly be very supportive of, figuring out a way, if you guys haven't already, where an applicant can, drop Chris a copy of their PowerPoint and have him run through it as they speak. I would imagine you guys that's probably a lot easier of a solution if you aren't already doing that.
Yeah, that's actually what we prefer to do. I don't know if you remember, we had one presentation last spring where was the one and only time we allowed a screen share, and the applicant's Wi-Fi went out, and so it froze our meeting. And so for that reason, we request their presentations in advance. It also gives us the opportunity to save that as part of the public record, and then we have them tell us to advance their slides, and that seems to be working well.
So, I would just say, I think we've been lucky so far that there haven't been any Zoom bombing issues. I've been in a hearing where there has been, and it's caused quite a bit of chaos, honestly, and hearings ending early without a proper continuance, which means that items have to be renoticed. It's led to a whole lot of disruption that, in terms of risk reward, I'm not sure there was really the reward on the side of just being able to see someone's face as they speak. I feel like as a commissioner, I've been able to solidly absorb the public comment, both via, predominantly via phone. So I would be perfectly fine maintaining the status quo. Not something I'll follow my sword on. I don't think it's a huge issue, but if we're going to be making sort of a decision of whether to do it or not, I feel like it's working fairly well. I'm also hopeful that there's a light at the end of the tunnel here and we might be back in person, and hopefully not the too distant future. So those are my initial thoughts, at least, on it. Commissioner Pilch.
Yeah, well, I'll speak on this since I brought it up. It struck me that I certainly can understand for members of the public, especially those we don't know. Although in Albany, usually most of the public speakers are known to us and are people who show up time after time. But having members of the public comment, having folks not be able to bomb us certainly seems reasonable. But the applicant is a known quantity, and the applicant is someone who's already put forward their application, their fees to the city. This is someone that I don't think we have any concern about Zoom bombing from, or if we did, that would be a very rare occurrence. So I think that it does really detract from the experience when you cannot see everyone on the call, when that person is just either a black box on the Zoom screen, or if you're not a panelist like we all are, you don't even see that there is that person on the screen. There's just a disembodied voice. So I do think that being able to see that person is important, and also most like the in-person experience. If we were in person, everyone would be able to see each other. So I think we should try to emulate that as much as possible. That really is the public hearing process. So I much prefer if we can give the applicants the same, promote them to panelists so that we can see their faces. And certainly for technical reasons, it seems perfectly fine that we can control their presentation. That's it.
Am I on? I think I am.
You are. Yeah, go ahead, Commissioner Donaldson.
Yeah, I don't know what to think about this. I agree with both sides, I guess. I don't know what to think. And to me, it's not a big deal. I think the meetings have gone fine. I completely agree that the staff should have control of the PowerPoint and the data that's presented to us in advance, and it should be part of the record. It hasn't bothered me that the applicants haven't been on, but I understand Nick's comment that it might be nice to see them at the same time. So I wouldn't know how to resolve this. I guess one question that comes to my mind as well. To me, it's 6 to 1, half dozen the other, but what does the city council do? Or does the city council do anything differently? Do they invite applicants or outsiders? I suppose consultants to the city council would always go on, just like Barry did tonight, but I don't know.
When we've had consultants who are an extension of staff, they of course are promoted to panelists, and they have the video image. When we've had development applications that have gone to city council, their faces are not projected. The video function is off. And we operate in the same way of advancing the slides based on their cue.
Okay, I don't know.
On the other hand, maybe it's not the exact same scenario, but I've done some presentations, presentations of certificate when I was on the council to members of the public, and I had them promoted to panelists. So specifically so we could see their video. So that's perhaps another side to it.
Commissioner McLeod.
No, I'm a little ambivalent. If it makes the meetings more complicated or more cumbersome, then I think we should not do it. But, if it could be done fairly easily, I wouldn't be opposed per se. And I agree with that any kind of presentation should be given to staff and controlled by staff and then part of the public record. I don't think we need an unscripted presentation, something that could be sent in and reviewed in advance. I'm fine getting information from applicants and other speakers, just, through hearing them. I don't really need to see them necessarily to make my decisions. So I don't think it's necessary. But if it is part of the democratic process to have for us to see their faces, I'm not sure that's completely necessary either as part of as part of our process. I don't think it prevents us from doing our job. So, and I agree that things have been going pretty well so far. I can't say that it's not working. So, I'm a little ambivalent. So that's it.
Okay.
Commissioner Monin, thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Pilch. I would support allowing them to be present on video as long as the presentation is controlled by the planning staff and the documents have been submitted in advance for record and for sharing with the commission. Having them on screen, being able to see their face gives some personal touch. That I think creates a better situation between the two parties.
Okay.
I think we've got a little bit of a split bag here, so I'm not sure how helpful it is for staff to make a final decision here. But do you want any further thoughts from us or coming to a consensus, or do you guys want to take it back and noodle on it a bit, or how would you like to move forward? Because we don't need to take a motion, right? This is not oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't think there's a need to take a formal motion necessarily. But, as I said, it's your meeting. And so if it's the consensus that you're leaning towards not doing this, I think we can take that direction and move forward. I mean, unless you feel strongly about taking a vote on this.
I wouldn't have characterized it consensus of not. Sounds like it's kind of mixed with two people in favor. Or would you characterize yourself as opposed, Chair?
I lean towards the side of not seeing faces and sticking more with status quo. in terms of the hearings are run. But that's why I said at the beginning, though, like not something I'll fall on my sword on, but I'm not, I think things are working now and I'm not sure it's worth the risk. I think sometimes it's actually nice to, for me at least, to make a not see somebody's face and have that factor into any subconscious, conversation. I know it's different than in real life, but I'm fine with it just moving forward the way we've been doing it, consistent with City Council.
Would commissioners, well, I'm not sure that City Council has a policy on this, but would commissioners be okay if we tried it and see how it went?
I'd be fine with that. Or I would be okay if we wanted to have staff ask the applicant if they felt like they really wanted to present their face. I mean, again, there are probably some people who are just as happy not showing their faces.
Yeah, I really want to be sensitive to the consent of the applicants in this case, because I know, some
Totally.
who do this routinely don't have an issue. Others are a little more camera shy and are more comfortable not having their face on screen and simply just extending a verbal, discussion for the commission. So maybe that's what we could do, is offer, talk to applicants in advance of the meeting and give them the option.
I also want to be cognizant, sort of from an equity perspective here, not everyone has a webcam. I think there are a lot of people who, even if they have, computers and are able to participate in a Zoom, they don't have a webcam hooked up. And so I also don't want to be setting a precedent where, those who have it get to be able to sort of put on their show, and those who don't have it don't have that same opportunity. So I do kind of like the sort of egalitarian aspect of sort of an all or nothing approach here, which is why I was kind of leading also in part towards the nothing, but
yeah. One other thing, I mean, I know all of us have made adjustments, going on Zoom, but I can recall a few times where applicants have had their kids in the background, they've had background noises and perhaps other distractions. And I think that's one reason why sometimes the anonymity may be preferred.
Yeah, well, I think absolutely not. We don't want to force people or perhaps reveal that people don't have access to the technology. On the other hand, if we were in person, we would all be seeing each other's faces. So to be camera shy is a little bit of a strange thing in this situation. It is once again, it is a public hearing. It is meant to be in public. So, but anyway, I think I've said enough at this point.
So hopefully we gave you staff enough to go back and noodle on. And certainly if we want to agendize it again, or if you guys want to do a little trial run or not.
I think for the March 10th meeting, we will have 4 residential remodel applications. So that may be a good opportunity to work with those different applicants to determine if they would consent, and then we can see how it goes from there.
Sounds great.
Well, so an applicant would it be one designated person, or would it be?
It would be one designated person.
Whoever the property owners are, plus the architect or designer, or?
Yeah, I think we would ask them to make a decision on that. So if the architect is the lead, for example, they would be representing the project. If the homeowner wanted to speak to the specifics, they could do so through the attendee function.
Okay.
With that, I don't see any attendees in the waiting room here, but I did want to open it up for public comment opportunity since this is our public hearing on this item. So we'll just give it a second here. But if there are any members of the public who would like to speak on this item, whether to show their faces or not in the future, if they were an applicant in the future, now's your time. All right, seeing none, we'll go ahead and close public comment. And I think we talked this one around the bend. So we'll go ahead and close this item then and move on to item 8 on the agenda, announcements and communications. It looks like we have one item 8-1, Planning Commissioner email correspondence.
Yeah, this is just a clarifying point for the commission. So over the course of the past year, different commissioners, I think most recently Commissioner Donaldson and then Commissioner McLeod, have forwarded correspondence to staff to forward to the full commission. These were not on quasi-judicial actions. In other words, pending applications. This was on long-range planning efforts. And we have learned that in consulting with the city attorney, there is obviously a restriction on doing that with quasi-judicial action, which is why we don't do that. On long-range plans, however, the same restriction does not apply, which is why we've done that. So it's given commissioners an opportunity in the past to provide more complete comments that then are distributed to the commission. However, in conferring with our city attorney, she said that while there isn't any explicit prohibition on that, she recommends as a best practice to not do that. So we wanted to make the full commission aware that we are no longer going to be doing that based on the advice of our legal counsel.
It's the way I think. Really, that's very upsetting. And it gives me a chance to sit down, go through an issue, read material. I've read 2 books, these are important issues. This is why I'm on planning and zoning. And gather data and then put it together. And that's the way I do. This is very frustrating. Very frustrating. And I disagree with it. And I think that we should have the flexibility to do this. And I'm happy to have it linked to long-term planning. We hardly ever get to discuss. I'd like to know what other commissioners are thinking about some of these issues. We never have a chance to do it. And in meetings, it's just a good way to get it initiated. And that's why. So anyway, those are my thoughts. So my initial thought is that I'm angry about it. I should be allowed to do that. And I know what you think, Ian. Probably the same thing.
Well, yeah, I agree. I'm not saying I'm angry about it, but what I find difficult about our long-range planning efforts are that you have a 2 to 3 to 5 minute period to make a statement.
Yeah.
And you really cannot say very much. It's really very limited. Very difficult to go into depth. It's kind of talking points. So, I've appreciated it as an opportunity to develop an idea or an argument or a point of view or site research, and present things more in depth with some background. It's like, not just, I think this should happen, but here is what my thinking and reasoning is, and here's the background. And I've done it a couple of times, and I've appreciated the opportunity to do it. And actually, I was surprised that we were able to do it. I wasn't expecting it, but I think I followed your lead, Commissioner Donaldson's lead. Did it once or twice, and that's okay. Well, if he can do it and staff is sending it out, then that's okay. So
I might have started. I never thought it would not be okay. Of course, it should be.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it was happening in past years. I have no idea, or previous to my first 2 years. So I find it disappointing. It's very hard to share ideas in depth. I think even in this forum, it's difficult. There's only a few minutes to speak and get a point across. So, I would push back. It's not something I want to do very often because I was concerned about Brown Act violations, that maybe this is a sign of a group meeting if you're sending out some kind of letter like that, but I don't think we want to be bombarding each other with memos all the time either. So I think it should be something that we do judiciously. So anyway, I would maybe get a little more, I would push back a little bit on what the city attorney says or recommends. And
I think it's
if there's any other examples where it's led to a problem, or are there other communities where it has been disciplined as a Brown Act or some sort of other violation? I don't know. I mean, are there concrete examples where it's been found to be detrimental to the discussion process or the decision-making process? I'd be interested in knowing that.
Commissioner Pilch?
Yeah, having spent 12 years on commissions and council, I had a chance to think about this a lot. And the basic tenet that the Brown Act puts forward is that the business of the public should be done in public. Yeah. So when you have email done and it's not accessible to the public, that does present a problem in my mind. And I've actually done this in the past with the council, but I was told, or actually I think I directed staff, that if I sent email to other council members, it must be part of the public record. It needs to get on the, yeah, it needs to get on the agenda as part of the public record. The public needs to see it as well, not just the members of the body. So that's one part to it. But something Commissioner McLeod said led me to think that, well, there is kind of a, the public meeting setting does give you kind of constraint where you do have to make your point in a certain amount of time. And maybe it's even an issue of equity in some cases. If there's someone with a lot of time to be writing a lot of emails, a lot of letters, which can be made part of the public record, and there's someone else who does not have that time, but does put in the effort and time to be at the public meeting, where that's the only chance they have to speak, is that fair? Is that fair that that other person maybe weighs in more? So something that you said, Commissioner McLeod, you know, how would you, could you even limit, would there be a limit to this, or would that even make sense? So in that way, I think I see it getting kind of problematic in that you're having kind of this dual participation of the live public meeting and the letters, the email. So I'm not surprised about the city attorney's ruling on this, but I think that if you have questions or comments, I would recommend that you do speak with the city attorney about it.
Just to clarify, whatever Commissioner Donaldson has sent or I have sent, it has been sent to staff first, who then has put it into the public record. So it's not like I'm just hitting reply all or, you know.
No.
So yeah, it's deliberately been a letter that staff vets and essentially then posts to the public record.
That was my understanding. What I didn't know is whether those made that actually onto the agenda of the meetings as well. Because that would be the appropriate thing in my mind. Is that
so in the past,
public...
that's a clarifying point.
Okay.
When Ian had provided written comments earlier last year, we did include that as correspondence received after the packet release. So it is published, it becomes part of the public record, it's accessible through Granicus.
Yeah, and I've asked for that.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Well,
Any
other
final
thoughts by other commissioners?
I don't have a whole lot of additional commentary to provide here, so I'm fine sort of heeding. I understand the issue, absolutely. I also will listen to the city attorney's direction. So if that's the direction we're being given, so be it. Happy to just mean some of our hearings may be longer as we read our 3-page soliloquies of thoughts and information. And we may also want to consider in terms of an ask to staff that if, especially as we're working through a lot of these really dense long range planning conversations, that maybe we want to agendize, opportunities for us to discuss, at a more, really refined topical level, so we can really dig into really granular things when we're not having to make a recommendation or balance 10 different policy objectives, but we can just talk about, an FAR conversation or a, pure density conversation. And that maybe is what it means, is that way we can all do our collective, homework in advance and get to focus in on those topics while not having to talk about everything else. So.
Yeah, and we can definitely make those adjustments in future agendas if there is the desire to do that. This is a good segue into my next announcement, and that is a Brown Act training on March 18th, timely enough. You should have received an email from our city clerk, Ann Sue, for saving the date. And as I understand it right now, that actually will be led by our city attorney. So there will be another email reminder. We'll also remind you again at the meeting of March 10th, but that is just general information for you.
I predict that's going to be a long meeting then. Lots of questions.
Yeah, and also I don't think we'll all be up on the screen since it will encompass every advisory body in the city.
Okay.
Well, I had hoped to be in Joshua Tree that day, and so I may miss the meeting. And Ann has already told me that it would be recorded and I could watch it afterwards. So I may be able to make it. I'll try to make the meeting, on Zoom. I don't know yet.
With that, then we'll move on to item 9. Next meeting, March 10th, same time, same place. And with that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Another
Okay.
successful
Thank you
virtual.
all.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.